Good morning, everybody. Hope you guys are doing really well, and I hope you guys really enjoyed doing the Oregon Trail yesterday. It was kind of awesome to see you guys play a game that I played back when I was a kid in elementary school in the 90s. And not only that, some of you guys did so well that you guys got on the high scores. You managed to get to Oregon. Meanwhile, Mr. Shoens, when he was in elementary school, always died to cholera or some type of disease. Oh well, it happens. Today we're going to be talking a little bit more about westward expansion. Make sure you guys get that worksheet from RenWeb and turn it in at turnitin.com once we conclude this. But without further ado, let's get going. So what was the West? Well, depending on where you're at and what time period, that might be different. Like for us in Florida, the West equals Tampa. But this isn't the West we're going to be talking about. The West that we're referring to is like states like California, New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona. We're talking about that territory, the West. We're not talking about like West Coast Florida. We're talking about West Coast US, nor are we talking about like John Wayne West. Remember, courage is being scared to death, but saddling up anyway. It's the best I got for a John Wayne impression. I'm sure my grandfather's rolling in his grave. Anywho, so when it comes to land acquisition in the United States, the Revolutionary War did a great job in giving us a ton of territory, and not only that, a country. So we gained everything that belonged to the British, minus Canada. Then we bought something known as Louisiana, and if you can look at the map, it basically doubled the size of the US, thanks to Thomas Jefferson working out a deal with Napoleon Bonaparte. But you notice that there's some territory that belongs to the US today that isn't quite belonged to the US yet, at least during the time of the Louisiana Purchase. Yeah, like that's the West, what we're talking about today. With all that territory we had gained, people started dreaming of taking it all. And that's where the term manifest destiny comes from. This idea that the United States was destined to expand from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific, from sea to shining sea, which is why you have that phrase in the song America the Beautiful. But today we're going to be talking about not how we gained California and stuff like that. Today we're going to be focusing specifically on the Battle of the Alamo and then get to a prelude to tomorrow's, or not tomorrow, Wednesday's discussion, which will be when the United States goes to war with Mexico. But first, some background information. This is everything Mexico owned at the time of this time period. So everything in green belongs to Mexico. Now the astute student will be like, well, doesn't it actually belong to Spain, Mr. Shones? Not anymore because Mexico had won its independence from Spain in 1821. If you remember anything such as the Monroe Doctrine, you get the idea. Once Spain's power subsided, all these former colonies were now independent, and Mexico was the biggest of them all. Soon, though, Americans decided to start settling into what was then Mexico's northern border, which, if you look at it like right around where Texas is, that's where they're going to go. Um, but when they go there, they're not going to become Mexicans. They're going to retain all their U.S. customs, which will lead to some problems in a bit. In fact, the first people to come to Texas that were Americans was a guy named Stephen F. Austin, who basically was a guy from Virginia who was granted the right to start a little colony in Texas-owned Mexico, and he brought 300 families with him into that area in 1825. If you remember States and Capitals last year, you now know why it's called Austin, Texas. In fact, a lot of cities in Texas are named after famous people in Texan history. But anywho, there's going to be starting to get some conflict when it comes to these Texans and Mexico. Now, the territory belongs to Mexico, but a ton of people in the U.S. are settling in it. So the colony is going to be incredibly successful. Just like Texas today is an incredibly successful state because of a lot of natural resources and open land, it's going to be very successful for people back then as well. And soon it got to a point that Americans outnumbered the native Tejanos population 6-1, meaning there were 6 Americans for every native Tejano person in Texas. And the Mexican government is going to start flexing its muscle a little bit because it owned the territory and it was the government of that territory and a Mexican flag was there. And that's going to start upsetting American settlers there. Well, the reason why the Mexican government was starting to act on a few things was for basically 3 reasons. One, the dominance of Roman Catholic Church in Mexico. The U.S. is a Protestant nation, so Protestants and Catholics, if you know anything about the Reformation, they don't always get along. So Mexico is trying to dominate because of religious reasons, and also because of Mexican citizenship and the Spanish language. People are not speaking Spanish in in Texas today, and when you have a population of 6-to-1 English speakers versus Spanish speakers, that doesn't look really well if you actually own the territory. So Mexico's like, all right, we need to start changing this. This is crazy. But the biggest one was that Mexico had outlawed slavery in 1829. The Texans that were Americans who went to Texas brought their slaves with them. So you see where maybe there might be a problem here. Mexico is Catholic, the Texans are Protestant. Mexico had abolished slavery, and the Texans had slaves. So Texas and Mexico are not going to be on the same page. Now, there's going to be a revolt in Texas. Basically, Mexico is going to start doing some things that the Texans are not going to like. First, they close Texas from American immigration, meaning they're like, all right, there's just way too many Americans coming into Texas. We need to close the border, essentially, which the Texans did not like. The Texans also had to start paying taxes to Mexico. Pretty much Mexico had been giving them a free ride at that point, and then it's like, all right, now you got to pay your fair share. Many at that point were starting to think and wish to break away from Mexico at that point. In other words, they were like, why are we dealing with this stuff? I mean, one, we're Americans, and two, it's like, it's Mexico. I mean, that they don't have all the best armies or anything like that. They were under Spanish rule for so long. But then finally, Mexico's president, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, or Santa Anna for short, starts sending in troops to end revolts. So with all that stuff, that became a combination for a recipe of disaster or maybe a recipe of freedom, as in Texas decides to leave while they can. If you're sending in troops, if you're forcing taxes, if you're closing the borders, we're going to declare independence at that point. And logically, think of it this way. These are Americans in Texas. All we know about is declaring independence and stuff like that. It worked really well for us with the British, right? So why not against Mexico? Then you have Sam Houston and the Revolution. Does that last name Houston sound familiar? It should, because Houston's one of the biggest cities in Texas today, and Sam Houston was one of the generals for the Texan army against Mexico. So the Texans are going to clash with Santa Anna's army. These are just Americans who had migrated there, who knew how to pick up a rifle and fight, and were trying to fight for their independence. Sam Houston, the general, and Texan leaders formally declared Texas independent in 1836 by signing the Texas Declaration of Independence. So Texas was its own country at that point, but obviously Mexico had a few things to say about that. There was a lot of battles in this war between Mexico and Texas, but there was only a couple famous ones, such as the Battle of the Alamo. So the Texans, facing the giant army of Santa Anna, retreat to something known as the Alamo. It was an old mission church, and for 12 days, 150 people fought in this church and held off an army of 6,000 Mexicans. At one point, 183 Texans were killed by Santa Anna's army, which was essentially virtually everybody in the building. And then people saw the Alamo fall, and they saw the bravery of the Texans there, fighting to literally the last man. As in, when Santa Anna opened the door of the Alamo, there was not a single Texan there alive. Most people would have surrendered eventually, but the Texans continued to fight bravely until they could fight no more because they were dead. And thus, people started chanting, "Remember the Alamo." Because essentially, like, we won't stop fighting until either we win or all of us are dead. Here's a really interesting picture of the Alamo from an artist, which, long story short, Davy Crockett dies among those in the Alamo. And just for short summary, Texas, the Alamo, especially for your worksheet, it was an old missions church, 12 days, 150 people held off an army of 6,000. You can pause if you need the rest. I want to take a discussion and talk about why we remember the Alamo. So let's kind of keep this all in a historical context. It's nice to see that Texas is fighting for its independence and stuff like that. And it's like cool because we like Texas nowadays. It's one of our 50 states. But keep in mind, the whole problem here with Mexico and Texas is one of them is Texas wants to keep their slaves. So the people fighting in that fort were fighting a war for the ability to keep their slaves that Mexico was trying to abolish because Mexico had already abolished slavery. And maybe if you ever go into San Antonio, that's one of the biggest tourist traps in the town. In fact, a lot of people love going there. Well, maybe it's not for good reasons. If it's the slavery thing, maybe it's more of I want to see where Davy Crockett died defending the Alamo. I don't know. We got to move on though. So the Alamo falls, and eventually Sam Houston is going to lead Texas to victory at the Battle of San Juanito. Long story short, Santa Anna, the leader of Mexico, is going to be captured by the Texans. So imagine if like our president was captured. Do you think we have lost the war? We would. So Santa Anna is going to be forced to surrender, and he signs a treaty agreeing to leave Texas, and Texas would become its own thing. And that's our Lone Star Republic there. Texas will technically be a sovereign nation between the years of 1836 and 1846. And if you're wondering, that doesn't quite look like Texas. Well, that's all the territory that Mexico had given up. Anywho, so moving on, eventually Texas wanted to join the U.S. as soon as it could. You know, most people would be wanting to stay as their own nation, but Texas did not because Texas had a ton of debt from that war with Mexico, basically to the point that the country would fall apart if they couldn't pay it off. One of the nice perks of a state joining the United States is the U.S. assumes all the debt, meaning that Texas debt would be paid off by the United States government, and they're basically Americans anyway, so why not? However, this is 1836 at that point, at least when Texas gets their independence. Andrew Jackson is still president of the United States. Andrew Jackson refused to support Texas annexation because he was afraid, and his vice president was also afraid, that if you added Texas to the Union, you would drive the Union apart because there would be more slave states than there would be free states. But eventually, both Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren will both be gone, and William Henry Harrison will be in office. So does that mean William Henry Harrison does something and he brings Texas into the Union? No, he died in a month. There's no way he could have done that. But his vice president, then 10th president, John Tyler, does. So, John Tyler, in case you didn't see the pictures, there's the difference. So, John Tyler wanted to annex Texas to make it a part of the Union, but he wasn't nominated for a second term, meaning that he didn't have the ability with Congress to get it done because he was a lame duck president at that point. Well, there was another president at that point, James K. Polk, who decided to run as a Democrat in 1844 to annex both Texas as well as Oregon into the United States. And once Polk wins that election, Polk will become the 11th president. John Tyler will ask Congress to basically get everything ready for him so that way Texas could be admitted into the Union very quickly, which they do. Polk, keeping his promises, negotiates a deal with the British to annex Oregon, and which would eventually turn into Washington, Oregon, and parts in Idaho. And that's how Texas will join the United States. And it's also why they named a city Tyler, Texas, because of John Tyler. Yeah. And there's a lot more cities, but I won't go into it. Anywho, that's a short summary of how Texas goes from being Mexican to the United States. Now, on Thursday, we're going to be talking about how everything else west is going to become part of the United States. And it's going to involve more war with Mexico. Stay tuned.